There is a story that the Soviet government buried for 12 years. Not because it was shameful, not because it was a failure, because it was too extraordinary. Because if it got out, if the world knew what one starving prisoner had done, it would prove something the Soviet machine could not afford to prove, that a single man, alone, with nothing, can rewrite the outcome of an impossible situation. February 8, 1945. A Nazi airfield on the Baltic coast. A man who weighs 84 pounds, the weight of a 12-year-old child, climbs into the cockpit of a Heinkel, a 111 German twin-engine bomber. He has never sat in this aircraft before. He cannot read the instrument panel. It is in German, a language he does not speak. His arms are so weak from 8 months of starvation that he can barely lift them above his shoulders. The airfield around him is one of the most heavily defended in the entire Third Reich. Watchtowers, machine gun posts, anti-aircraft batteries, hundreds of armed soldiers. Behind him, crammed into a space designed for 5 crew members, are 9 other men, all of them concentration camp prisoners, all of them starved, all of them wearing striped rags. If they are caught in the next 60 seconds, they will be shot on the runway. If the engines don't start, they will be shot on the runway. If they manage to take off, a feat that requires 50 pounds of force on the control column, and he weighs 84 pounds total, Soviet anti-aircraft guns on the other side of the front will try to finish what the Nazis started. Lieutenant Mikhail Devyataev, Soviet Air Force, prisoner number 104534, reaches for the ignition. To understand what Devyataev did, you need to understand what he was before the war took him. He wasn't born into a military family. He grew up in a small village in what is now the Republic of Mordovia in central Russia. One of 13 children. His father died when he was small. His mother held the family together on almost nothing. He worked his way into flight school through sheer persistence at a time when Soviet aviation was expanding at a furious pace. Stalin wanted pilots. Devyataev became one of the best. By 1944, Lieutenant Mikhail Devyataev had 17 confirmed aerial kills, 2 Orders of the Red Banner, the Soviet equivalent of multiple Distinguished Flying Crosses. He was exactly the kind of pilot you put at the front of a formation, calm, instinctive, aggressive when he needed to be. He had survived the most brutal air war in human history. The Eastern Front was not a place where men lasted long. The average life expectancy of a Soviet pilot in the early war years was measured in weeks. Devyataev had been flying combat missions for years. Then, one afternoon over the city of Lviv in July 1944, a Focke-Wulf 190 dropped out of the sun from above. Cannon rounds tore through his engine. He bailed out at 2,000 feet. German soldiers were waiting when he landed. What happened to Soviet prisoners of war in Germany was not the same as what happened to Western Allied prisoners. The Nazis had decided that Slavic people were subhuman. Soviet prisoners were not afforded the protections of the Geneva Convention. They were worked to death, starved, left outside in winter, used as medical experiments. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, roughly 3.3 million died in captivity. That number is not a typo. Devyataev arrived at a standard POW camp and immediately started planning to escape. That was who he was. He didn't accept conditions. He calculated how to change them. First escape attempt, caught. Second attempt, caught. Third attempt, caught. After the third, the Germans reclassified him. He was no longer a prisoner of war, a category with at least nominal protections. He was now designated a dangerous subversive. They sent him to Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen was not a labor camp. It was a place of calculated destruction. 30,000 prisoners, gas chambers, a death rate of 800 people per month. Prisoners received 700 calories per day, less than a third of what an adult needs to simply maintain their body weight. The average survival time was 4 months. Every morning, Devyataev woke up next to men who had died in the night. Every evening, smoke rose from the crematorium. He was watching himself disappear, body consuming itself from the inside out, each week a little lighter, a little weaker, a little closer to the smoke. He decided he would not die there. The question was how. In October 1944, the Nazis needed technical labor at a classified facility. They went through Sachsenhausen looking for prisoners with mechanical or engineering backgrounds. Devyataev volunteered. He had no idea where they were sending him. He only knew that Sachsenhausen had a 4-month survival window, and he had already used 3 of them. The prisoners were transported by night. In the morning, Devyataev looked out and understood exactly where he was. Peenemünde, island of Usedom, Baltic coast. Rockets rose from the earth like enormous silver needles and vanished into the gray sky above the Baltic. This was the birthplace of the V1 and V2, the weapons that were raining destruction on London, the most advanced weapons research facility in the world, and right next to it, an airfield. Heinkel bombers on the tarmac, Messerschmitt fighters taxiing to runways, transport planes arriving and departing on a constant schedule. Devyataev was a slave laborer assigned to runway maintenance. His job was to break rocks and fill potholes under armed guard. But he was watching. He was cataloging flight schedules, refueling patterns, guard rotations, which aircraft were kept ready, which were undergoing maintenance, how pilots moved through pre-flight checks, the sequence of switches, the order of instruments, the way their hands moved across panels he couldn't yet touch. The average prisoner at Peenemünde survived 8 weeks. Devyataev had 3 weeks in the bank. He needed to move. One aircraft kept appearing in his mental notes, a Heinkel, He-111 with the marking GA on its fuselage, always fueled, always positioned in a ready state. It belonged to the airfield's deputy commandant, kept on standby for urgent flights. It was, in the vocabulary of escape planning, a gift. Now he needed people he could trust with his life. In a concentration camp, that is the hardest thing in the world to find. The Nazis had deliberately destroyed the social bonds between prisoners. Informants were everywhere, men who would trade information for extra food, report an escape plan, and eat that night. The system was specifically engineered to make solidarity impossible. Devyataev moved slowly. He would start a small conversation, test a man's reactions, wait days before saying anything more, never reveal the plan in full until he was as certain as a man could be. He found Ivan Krivinogov first, a former sergeant, the largest man in their barracks despite the starvation. Krivinogov had attempted escape twice from previous camps, been beaten nearly to death both times. He had crossed some psychological threshold where death by escape and death by exhaustion were equivalent. At least escape was faster. Through Krivinogov, slowly, carefully, the team took shape. Vladimir Sokolov, a tank mechanic captured at Kursk who understood engines and might be useful with the Heinkel systems. Mikhail Devyataev, an infantry soldier, small and quick, useful for anything requiring stealth. Fyodor Adjimambetov, an artillery observer, the kind of man who stays calm when everything is on fire. 1 by 1, 9 men plus Devyataev. 10 prisoners planning to steal a Nazi bomber. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in every detail. February 8th, light snow falling across Peenemünde. Visibility reduced. Perfect. Devyataev's group is assigned to runway maintenance, standard detail, 10 prisoners, 1 guard. They have been doing this same work for weeks. The rhythm of it is known. Nobody watches closely on a cold morning when the snow is falling and the shift seems like every other shift. The guard assigned to them is young, new. He doesn't know the prisoners' faces well. At 12:15, he steps off the path to relieve himself, hidden from the watchtowers, alone with the prisoners for 30 seconds. Krivinogov moves. A shovel handle rises, falls. The guard goes down without a sound. They strip the uniform. Krivinogov puts it on. It's too tight across the shoulders. The boots are wrong. From 50 yards in falling snow, it will have to be enough. Now they walk. 10 prisoners, 1 man in a German uniform barking rough commands. 400 meters to aircraft GA. 300 meters. A real guard approaches from the left, rifle on his shoulder. Bored, he looks at the detail. Something is slightly wrong. The accent, the fit of the uniform, the way the prisoners are moving. But Peenemünde has thousands of non-German personnel, forced laborers from across occupied Europe, foreign volunteers. The world at this facility is strange. The real guard shrugs and walks on. 100 meters, 2 German mechanics are working near aircraft GA, routine maintenance. They look up as the group approaches. Confused, they weren't notified of a work detail. Before they can speak, two prisoners are on them. Fists and elbows, quick and brutal. The mechanics go down. Devyataev runs for the cockpit. The door's unlocked. He climbs in. The cockpit of a Heinkel. He-111 has over 100 switches. Every label is in German. Every instrument is calibrated to a system he has never trained on. The entire logic of the aircraft, fuel management, engine sequencing, hydraulics, navigation, is alien to him. He is a single-engine Soviet fighter pilot who learned everything he knows about the Heinkel by watching its pilots from 200 feet away through barbed wire. 9 men are piling in behind him, cramming themselves into spaces not designed for them. Someone is sitting on someone else. Someone is praying out loud. Devyataev stares at the panel. He finds what he thinks is the fuel primer, pumps it, finds the ignition sequence, or what he believes is the ignition sequence based on hand movements he memorized from a distance. Nothing happens. Silence. The engines don't catch. The propellers don't move. Someone behind him hisses, "Start it." He scans the panel again. There is something he missed, a step in the sequence, something a German pilot did every time that he had not understood from his watching position. Battery switch. He finds something that might be it, flips it up. The instrument lights come on. The panel comes alive. Left engine, fuel prime, ignition. The engine coughs, catches. The propeller begins to spin. A sound he knows, the sound of an engine breathing. Right engine, same sequence, both engines running. He releases the wheel brakes. The Heinkel begins to roll, too fast. He's heading directly toward another parked aircraft. He has never taxied a twin-engine bomber. The steering uses differential braking. Press left to turn left, right to turn right. Get it wrong and you spin. Get it very wrong and you flip 14,000 kilograms of aircraft onto its side. He stamps the left brake. The bomber lurches, slides sideways, almost tips. The prisoners in the back are thrown against the walls. Someone curses God. He finds the balance, gentle corrections. The aircraft finds its line. Behind them, someone has noticed the mechanics on the ground, shouts. An alarm begins to sound. They are 500 meters from the runway threshold. 400. A truck appears from behind a hangar. Soldiers in the back, rifles up, racing toward them. 300. The truck is faster than they are on the ground. If it reaches the runway before they take off, the soldiers will shoot out the tires, or shoot through the cockpit windows, or simply ram the aircraft. 200. Devyataev reaches the runway. He turns the bomber to align with the center line. The truck is 100 meters behind. He pushes both throttles forward. A Heinkel. He-111 fully loaded weighs 14,000 kilograms. It requires 400 meters of runway to reach takeoff speed, and it requires the pilot to pull back the control column with 50 pounds of force to lift the nose off the ground. Mikhail Devyataev weighs 84 pounds. He cannot lift the nose. The Heinkel is racing at 140 kilometers per hour. He is pulling the column toward his chest with everything he has. His arms, 8 months starved, muscles half consumed, are shaking. The column does not move. They are using up runway. The perimeter fence is ahead. The truck has reached the runway edge. Soldiers are jumping out, rifles rising. Devyataev screams into the cabin. 2 men stumble forward through the chaos. They grab the column with him. 3 men pulling together. Bullets crack past the cockpit. Someone in the back screams, whether from being hit or from fear, impossible to know. The column moves an inch, then another. The nose tilts upward, just slightly, just enough. The wheels leave the ground. Aircraft GA, a Heinkel HE-111 carrying 10 escaped concentration camp prisoners, becomes airborne at 12:21 p.m. on February 8, 1945. They climb into gray sky. Snow swirls around the wings. Peenemünde falls away below. For exactly 3 seconds, there is silence inside the aircraft. Then, Peenemunde's anti-aircraft batteries open fire. Black puffs of flak erupt around them. Shrapnel pings off the fuselage. Devyataev throws the aircraft into a banking turn. First west, to confuse anyone tracking their heading, then north over the Baltic Sea, then east. East toward Soviet lines, east toward something that might be called life. The German guns track them for 2 minutes. Then the clouds swallow the Heinkel. Inside, the situation is not good. 1 man is wounded. A piece of shrapnel caught him in the arm. They have nothing to bandage it with. Someone tears a strip from his prison uniform. Devyataev does not know the aircraft's fuel state with precision. The German gauge is in units he hasn't learned to read. He does not know their exact position. The navigation instruments are useless to him. He has a compass. He can read a compass. East. Keep flying east. The front line is somewhere ahead. 300 kilometers of enemy territory between them and Soviet lines. He pushes the throttles and flies. 20 minutes airborne. The fuel gauge needle has moved. 40 minutes. He can see fields and forests below when the cloud breaks. Military vehicles on the roads, all German, still deep in enemy territory. 50 minutes. Smoke begins trailing from the left engine. The anti-aircraft hit had done internal damage that is now making itself known. He reduces power to the left engine, adjusts the fuel mixture, fights the yaw, the aircraft constantly wanting to rotate left toward the dying engine. 60 minutes. The landscape below changes. Shell craters, burned villages, the ground carved up by artillery. The front is close, and then, below and ahead, Soviet anti-aircraft batteries see a German bomber flying toward their positions. The Soviet anti-aircraft gunners on the ground see what the physics of this moment demands they see. A Heinkel. He-111, a German bomber, approaching their defensive positions. They do not ask questions. They open fire. Tracer rounds rise from the ground like bright threads of light. Devyataev throws the Heinkel into evasive turns, but the aircraft is too heavy, too damaged, too slow. Bullets rip through the fuselage. Men scream in the back. The left engine, already damaged, already trailing smoke, erupts. Not metaphorically. Actual flames pour from the cowling. Oil sprays across the wing. The engine dies. On one engine, the Heinkel cannot maintain altitude. It begins to drop. 1,000 meters, 600 meters. He can see Soviet soldiers in trenches below, staring up at the falling German bomber. 300 meters. He aims for a snow-covered field, pulls back on the controls. The Heinkel hits the ground like a thrown stone. The landing gear collapses instantly. The belly scrapes across frozen earth. Metal tears. The propeller on the left engine hits the ground and disintegrates into shrapnel. Snow fills the cockpit windows. They slide 200 meters and stop. Devyataev is alive, bleeding, shaking. He turns to look into the cabin. 9 men, all moving, all alive. They scramble through the exits and fall into the snow. Soviet soldiers sprint toward them from the trenches, rifles raised, shouting in Russian. Devyataev stands in the snow in his concentration camp stripes, covered in blood and aviation fuel, weighing 84 pounds, and speaks the only words he has left to give.
Don't shoot. We are Soviet. Lieutenant Mikhail Devyataev, Soviet Air Force. We escaped from Peenemünde. We stole this aircraft from a Nazi rocket base.
The soldiers look at each other. Nobody believes him. Soviet counterintelligence took them into custody immediately. Not as liberated prisoners, not as heroes, as suspects. The interrogations began within hours. How did you survive when millions did not? How did you learn to fly a German aircraft? Who taught you? Who are your German contacts? Are you a spy? Are you a collaborator? The logic of the Soviet system was brutally simple. Real soldiers died fighting. Anyone who had been captured was, by definition, suspect. The fact that you were alive meant you had made some arrangement to stay alive. The fact that you had learned things in captivity meant you had talked to the enemy. Devyataev told them everything he knew. He described Peenemunde's layout in detail. The rocket launch facilities, the fuel storage locations, the dimensions of the V-2 launch pads, the guard rotations, the underground tunnels. This intelligence was extraordinary. It would prove genuinely useful to Soviet military planners and, later, to the scientists racing to build the Soviet space program. The interrogators wrote it all down, and then they sent him to a penal military unit. Still under suspicion, still not restored to his rank, still not trusted. The war ended 3 months later. They released him. They did not give him his medals back. They did not restore his rank. They did not call him a hero. They told him his story was classified. He was not to speak of it. Mikhail Devyataev went home. For 12 years, Mikhail Devyataev lived as an ordinary Soviet citizen. He worked as a ferry captain on the Volga River. He did not talk about the war. He did not talk about Peenemunde. He did not talk about February 8, 1945. While he guided passenger boats across quiet water, Soviet engineers were working with intelligence derived partly from his escape, from the structural details of Peenemünde he had memorized, from the technical data he had provided under interrogation, to build the rockets that would eventually launch the first satellite into orbit. He knew this. He couldn't say it. The 9 men who flew with him were scattered. Some tried to tell their story and were warned to stop. The Soviet doctrine on prisoner of war survivors was not kind. These were not men to be celebrated. These were men to be watched. And so, one of the greatest acts of courage in the entire history of the Second World War sat in a classified file in Moscow, unknown to the world, while the man who performed it drove a ferry back and forth across a river. 12 years. In 1957, a scientist remembered, Sergei Korolev was the chief designer of the Soviet space program, the man behind Sputnik, the man who would put Yuri Gagarin in orbit. He was one of the most important figures in 20th century science. Korolev had access to the intelligence files from the end of the war. He understood, in a way that military bureaucrats did not, the significance of what Devyataev had brought back from Peenemünde, the technical data, the physical layout of the facility, the knowledge of what the Germans had achieved. He went to Soviet officials and told them the truth about what the intelligence from that escape had contributed. He pressed the case. On August 15, 1957, 12 years, 6 months, and 7 days after the Heinkel touched down in a snow-covered field, Mikhail Devyataev was summoned. He was awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the country possessed, 12 years late. For an escape the government had spent a decade trying to erase. Here is what I keep coming back to. The standard version of this story is about courage, and it is about courage, extraordinary, almost incomprehensible courage. The math of what Devyataev did doesn't work on paper. An 84-pound man cannot exert 50 pounds of force on a control column. 10 starving prisoners cannot overpower a heavily armed military airfield. A Soviet fighter pilot cannot fly a German twin-engine bomber he has never trained on. None of it works on paper. And yet, but the story I keep thinking about is not the escape. It's the 12 years after. Devyataev survived Sachsenhausen. He survived Peenemünde. He survived a dogfight with Soviet anti-aircraft fire. He survived a crash landing. He survived the interrogations. And then he came home to a country that looked at everything he had endured, everything he had risked, everything he had done, and decided he was probably a traitor. The Soviet machine could not afford to celebrate him, because celebrating him meant acknowledging something complicated, that survival itself is an act of resistance, that the man who finds a way out of an impossible situation rather than dying inside it is doing something that requires more strength, not less. The doctrine said, real soldiers die fighting. Devyataev chose a different option. He chose to keep being dangerous. He chose to stay in the game long enough to do something that mattered. And when he finally got home, when the interrogations ended, when the war was over, when there was nothing left to fight, he did not rage against the system that had called him a suspect. He got a job on a river. He drove a ferry. He waited. He had already proven, in the most complete way imaginable, that he was the kind of man who survives. Now, all he had to do was survive this quieter thing. The indifference of a government that owed him everything and gave him nothing. He outlasted that too. Mikhail Devyataev lived to be 85 years old. He wrote a memoir. He gave lectures. He returned to Peenemünde once, in his old age, and stood on the runway where the Heinkel had been parked. He never stopped being a pilot. Not in any way that mattered. The 9 men who flew with him on February 8, 1945, they scattered across the Soviet Union, living ordinary lives largely unrecognized. Some received modest acknowledgement years later. None of them received what they deserved. The Heinkel, he-111 they flew is gone, scrapped somewhere in the aftermath of the war. No museum holds it, no monument marks the field where it came down, the most remarkable aircraft in the history of escape, piloted by a man who had no right to be flying it, carrying 10 men who had no right to be alive, vanished into the chaos of 1945 along with most of the physical evidence that any of it ever happened. What remains is the account, the testimony, the classified file that someone eventually opened, and the logic of the man himself. Every step of Devyataev's escape was built on one core idea, that the impossible is only impossible if no one has tried it yet. The guards at Peenemünde did not watch the aircraft because no prisoner had ever tried to steal one. It was considered beyond imagination. Devyataev's insight, and perhaps this is the most important thing about him, was that the guard's imagination was the vulnerability. He went where no one expected anyone to go. And that has made all the difference between a number in a ledger, prisoner 104534, and a name that deserves to be remembered.